Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, consultant, and I'll be your host. Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Dr. Richard Norris of Pandreco Energy Advisors and the excellent Energy IQ substack. I highly recommend people checking it out and subscribing. There's going to be links in the description. And he's here today to discuss one of my favorite topics, and that's energy geopolitics, with a little bit of history thrown into the mix as well. Hi, Richard. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Tammy. Great to be here. Thank you.
You know, you have such an interesting background and a wealth of experience, and I'm wondering if you can just take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience, your background, the origins of Pandreco Energy Advisors, and your Energy IQ Substack adventure.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try and make that brief, although it's quite a long story. I originally, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British, and I think that was the origin of us actually getting to discuss doing this podcast. Is you're a Canadian living in the UK, and I'm a Brit living in Canada, so that gives us interesting perspectives. My background is that I originally trained as a geologist as an undergrad. I did a master's in petroleum geology, and then I did a PhD in petroleum engineering at Imperial in London. I didn't greatly like living in cities, so when the opportunity came up, I joined Elf Aquitaine, which was the French state oil company, and their operational and research center was in the south of France, in Pau, in the foothills of the Pyrenees, which was a fantastic place to live and work. I then stayed with Elf, as it was known, for about 10 years. About half of it in France and half of it in West Africa. I worked in Angola in the mid-90s. I then took a very brief sabbatical where I lived in Peru for a year and a half because I had met my wife in Angola, and her second posting was to Peru, so I followed her there. But then I moved back to what was by then Total in La Défense in Paris in about the year 2000, I think it was. And having had a period in operations, I was put onto a new ventures group, which was very interesting work. We were looking at oil fields all over the former Soviet Union. But all of that time, I'd been looking at reserves and reserve estimates, trying to work out how much oil was in the ground, what the uncertainties were. And I was always interested as to what would happen when that went into the business and planning part of a large oil company. And for all sorts of corporate reasons, there was no opportunity to follow that within Total. So quite by lucky sort of coincidence, I met somebody who was setting up a reserves-based lending group in a French bank called BNP Paribas. And the idea being that banks lend money to junior oil companies that are small enough that they can't get debt through the debt capital markets, through the bond markets. So essentially, they mortgage their future production against oil, they mortgage their future production against the loan. And so the banks took a view that they needed to have an in-house sort of technical expert to decide whether these oil companies really were going to produce oil or not. So that was my job in Paris, and after a couple of years, our team had grown sufficiently that we split it in half and moved half the team to Geneva. So I lived on the French side of the border, but close to Geneva for the next 13 years. And after the great financial crisis, I had a feeling that the oil and gas business was going to change, and that it was quite likely that the group was going to be moved back to Paris, and I didn't want to move back to Paris. So I quit, and I joined a private oil company that was based in Geneva, where I was general manager of operations in India and Vietnam and Myanmar. That was a fascinating experience, but the travel was extraordinarily difficult, living in Geneva and having to do operations in those various countries. So it didn't last very long. And in about 2011 or 2012, I joined Helios Investment Partners as a consultant. And Helios is a private equity firm based in London that focuses exclusively on Africa. It is a multi-sector private equity firm, and they do all sorts of businesses like fintech and fast-moving consumer goods and telecoms and so on. But there was an opportunity to look at the energy space. So we did investments in 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015, right through, as you remember, the oil price crash of 2014. So it was a very difficult time. And I think one of the things that was interesting about the work in both the debt side and the equity side is that when you are providing debt or equity, you have to live with your investment decisions. You're not like an M&A banker where you put together a deal, you take your fees and you move on. It doesn't really matter what happens afterwards. Both in debt and equity, you have to see those through for multiple years, whatever the cycle of the oil price is, whatever the political and geopolitical uncertainties are. So it gives you a very long-term view of events. And I stayed with Helios until 2019. And what had happened was, and this is really where the segue into energy policy and geopolitics comes in, is that from about 2015 onward, we were getting very strong pushback from what are called the LPs, the limited partners, or the investors, those who provide the money. And these are pension funds, endowment funds. Quite a lot of them were based in North America, very blue chip. And they were getting very early on the divest from fossil fuel bandwagon. And this was well before Greta had started her Fridays for Climate approach. But it got to the point where we were being, we were investing in oil and gas and energy generally across Africa. And we were being told by some of these LPs that Helios would not be able to raise additional money if they continued to be doing oil and gas investing. So it was very clear that, money talks. Helios was absolutely not wedded to doing upstream oil and gas by any means. They have a very broad market segment and were absolute leaders in the African equity space. So it got me thinking about the social role of investing in oil and gas, particularly when it pertained to Africa, where we know 600 million people are in energy poverty. And it seemed almost counterintuitive to me that we would be investing in all sorts of different sectors, but ignoring the one sector that powers the economy. And that's really the beginning of what my journey into energy security and geopolitics is the notion that somehow for investors it's possible to invest in all other sectors of the economy and ignore the energy sector, because the energy sector will look after itself. And it's always kind of reminded me of, there's a cartoon of two young fish swimming in a river or a bowl of water, and an older fish saying, "How's the water, guys?" And their answer is, "What's water?" And the implication being, if you ask somebody, how's the energy system, they'll say, "What's energy?" Because it's just always there. We've been so good at providing it for so long that electricity always comes out of the socket. There's always gas at the petrol station, and somehow that familiarity, it kind of breeds a certain contempt. And I think when I hear people saying we should just stop oil, or that we've shut the coal-fired power stations in the UK, and so it's very easy, next step is to shut the gas-fired power stations, it makes me extraordinarily nervous about what happens next, because that kind of activist approach and public opinion feeds through to politicians. I believe there was a time when politicians were leaders and public opinion followed. I don't think that's the case anymore. Democracies are popularity contests. People worry about how they're going to get voted in, and the net result is we have very short-termism in energy policy. And energy policy doesn't work in short-termism, and it doesn't really matter whether you're building a dam, whether you're going to exploit a new oil field, a nuclear plant, and even with renewables, you have to think 20, 30 years into the future of how things will look. And we're making decisions that are almost knee-jerk reactions to short-term policy. And I think this is extremely dangerous. One of the reasons I moved to Canada, and if you'll allow me to continue this monologue for speaking again, I've got on my LinkedIn profile that I'm an energy refugee, and I say that quite flippantly, and I don't want to disparage genuine refugees, of whom there are many throughout the world. But in about 2020 or 2021, when my wife said, "Why don't we move to Canada?" and I should point out my wife is Canadian, my immediate reaction was, yes, absolutely. I was looking around at the damage being done to the UK, to the broader European energy structure, and it genuinely makes me very scared for the future. I've got 3 boys. I'm very happy that they are growing roots in Canada. But when I was moving here, one of the things I did was I was networking, and I spoke to somebody who was, who will remain nameless, but is very well connected in the political sphere in Canada. And his question was, why on earth would you want to move to Canada? And he actually put it a bit more forcefully than that. And, my answer to that is that there are many reasons we would do that. Obviously, the family reasons are high on the agenda. But at the end of the day, Canada has 200 years worth of everything. It's got vast agricultural potential. It's got a challenging climate for sure. But it's got oil, it's got critical minerals, it's got uranium, it's got forestry. And it has a very powerful southern neighbor, as we've discovered just recently. I have different ambitions on the future of Canada. But when you look at a very dystopian future, and I wrote about this on Substack a while ago, because there are very utopian futures that we see, and there was an article written about what the world would look like in 2030 or 2040, where nobody would own anything and would all be living in 15-minute cities, and energy would be free. Was one of the sort of the fundamental concepts in that sort of thought experiment. Well, energy is never going to be free. There's a potential energy is always going to get more expensive. And as it gets more expensive, people are going to get poorer. So I want to be, and my family, in a place where there is abundant energy and it can be got in an affordable manner. So, since the Second World War, North America has been described as Fortress North America because you have a very large moat on each side with the Atlantic and the Pacific. If you look forward, you've got Mexico, which has resources and a very young population. You have the US, which has a relatively good demographics considering its immigration policy. And you have Canada that has a lot of resources. I mean, the US has huge resources. Canada probably has even more. And again, we can get back to fresh water and all of the other things that are needed. If the rules-based order of the world broke down, if things got really bad, North America could survive independently. And I wrote an article about this a while ago called The World in 2040. And extrapolating from that, then the question is, what would happen to the rest of the world? And then it starts getting really challenging. We know 50% of the world's population lives in a relatively small circle centered on Southwest China. It includes all of the Indian subcontinent and Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, all these countries. They're generally resource poor, but very rapidly climbing up the development ladder. And there's absolutely no reason why they would want to stop, or no reason why they should stop. So what would happen is that there would be a resource grab, and that would imply these countries would be looking to Russia, they would be looking to the Middle East, and probably to Africa. And that then leaves 2 areas which are almost unaccounted for. South America, which would be interesting, but logically would align with North America, but politically might not, because there has been a lot of bad blood over the decades of meddling in South American politics from the north. But I think ultimately the economics would probably be working in that favor. And that leaves me with Europe, and Europe is resource poor. It has a lot of people, and it has what I think of as pretty suicidal energy policies at the moment. So when I look 20, 30 years into the future, I'm only really half joking when I say I'm an energy refugee and I've left Europe with a very clear reasoning behind that. So, long introduction, I'll stop there.
Well, you've brought up some really interesting points that I'd like to dive into a little bit deeper. On the first thing, if we could take a step back and look at the concept of energy security and how it can take different forms. Sometimes the definition of it can be somewhat complex and includes the concept of trade-offs. So quite often, Originally, at least with the International Energy Agency, when it was first formed in 1974, energy security meant affordable, accessible, secure energy to ensure that they wouldn't be cut off in times of war or something more drastic. And then it evolved to add and sustainably produced without really defining what sustainable is. But um, if I can also just add to this little bit is that you mentioned how some things are counterintuitive, and I think one of the biggest counterintuitives was when Winston Churchill decided to switch Britain's ships from running on coal, which Britain has a lot of, to running on oil, which at the time it didn't have domestically, though it did have a company producing it in Persia, or what is known as Iran now, and the British state bought 51% of it in 1914. So oil is better than coal for this use, and a calculation was made that it was worth the trade-off. How then would you describe Churchill's calculus of energy security, and how has that evolved over time with respect to the UK and the developments that came in the North Sea in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the Churchillian, when he was head of the Admiralty, was a really interesting turning point, because, as you say, from an energy security point of view, the obvious thing would have been to continue using coal. There was a lot of it. It could be produced cheaply. The problem is the energy density. Your battleships could last a lot longer at sea if they were powered with oil, and they could actually go faster. So the trade-off was your ability to project power on the oceans versus your security of supply. And I think Churchill's answer to that was, if you have a diversified supply of oil, you're not reliant on just one country or one well or whatever. That was sufficient. And I think that you can argue that has been the case. And it was the case up until 1970s. But then we had the energy shocks, which were the Arab oil embargo, and then followed by the Iranian Revolution. And I think we forget just how significant that was. When you look at it on a chart of today's prices, it doesn't look very much. But actually, oil went from $2 to 20, so it did a 10x in the space of less than, I think, 8 years. That would be like oil going from $80 today to $800. It's unimaginable what it would do to the global economy. What it did do was what you'd expect in a sort of a market-driven system, is that very high prices are a price signal for investment. And rather than just relying on the rather limited sources of existing oil, which were very much dominated by the Middle East and subsequently by OPEC, the objective was to try and find new sources of oil, and especially if they were not OPEC dominated. So we saw oil exploration pushing into more hostile environments: Alaska, deepwater Gulf of Mexico, the North Sea, which was driven by American companies, interestingly, at the beginning, both on the Norwegian side, the UK side, then the Norwegian side. And that then spread to deep water West Africa. So by 1990, mid 1990s, so the 25 years after, or actually 20 years after the middle of the oil price spike, that's when I was in Angola. We were doing drilling in 1,500 meters of water in the what was then considered deep. Now people drill in 3,000 meters of water and beyond. So the diversification of supply was very important, and it was extremely successful. And I think for the UK's point of view, there's a fascinating question as to what happened politically at that point, because prior to that, in the 1970s, the UK was going through rapid deindustrialization. We had the winter of discontent, we had 3-day working week, we had strikes all over the place, and there was which is probably very pertinent for today, there was the bailout by the IMF, when no one would lend money to the UK because its economy was in such a shambles. Then two things happened. The conventional wisdom says that sort of Thatcher and Reagan came to power in the UK and the US, and Reaganomics kind of took over, and the Thatcherite equivalent of that, free market enterprise, unleashed the animal spirits, and it turned everything round. The UK became a booming economy. House prices have gone up ever since. The other way of looking at that is that the UK suddenly basically hit a pot of gold. The Forties and Brent fields in the North Sea are absolutely world class, even by today's standards. These are 4 or 5 billion barrel recoverable fields with extremely good engineering and physics. The recovery factors are huge. They're in 60% and above. So these were really extraordinary. It's like a family's just found a lottery ticket, because the oil and gas, it does two things. It provides tax revenues to the country, and I think in the UK there's somewhere in the region of 460 billion pounds over the last 20-25 years have come in from North Sea oil. But at the same time, your balance of payments improves because you're not buying oil from abroad. So what that does is it gives the government a lot more money to play with. And in the 1980s, what happened was there were tax cuts. Essentially, instead of tax rates going up to pay for increasing costs, and the Thatcherite revolution did increase unemployment for a while, and it had to be paid for. So some of it's paid for from the North Sea oil revenue. But ultimately, we had very low taxation rates in the UK. And there's a fascinating study that was done by a journalist, I think from The Guardian, who said, follow the money. And his answer was that, well, when the middle class get tax cuts, they save money. And generally speaking, the way people like to save money the best is firstly in real estate, and secondly in the stock market. And what we saw in the 80s and 90s was a boom in house prices and a boom in the asset classes. So the implication is that UK house prices have been driven by the wealth coming out of North Sea oil. The interesting question about that is what happens next, because obviously we know that North Sea oil and gas is in decline, and now it's in very rapid decline because of the windfall tax and government policy squeezing it. Well, what's happening is, of course, that the UK is going to have to import more oil and gas because it's not reducing the amount it's used by any significant amounts. That's going to have an effect on the balance of payments. I'm a firm believer that when Thatcher said running a country's budget is not very different from running a household budget, that she was correct. There are people who disagree with that, and I was seeing some stuff on LinkedIn the other day about this, saying, no, if you've got sovereign currency, you can do whatever you want, you can just print it, which is true, but there's a consequence to that. And I think the UK is going to see this, and we saw this under the Liz Truss budget, which the markets didn't like, and we're beginning to see it under the current administration, that if you think you're going to borrow money to create growth, there's a question that the market will ask you, that what happens if that growth doesn't happen? You will have more debt, you will be less credit worthy. If we're going to lend you money, it's going to cost you more. So at a time when you're going to be paying more for your interest payments, and I believe it's in the order of 60 billion pounds a year at the moment, you're also going to be importing more oil and gas and getting less oil and gas revenue. So you're getting into what I'd call very rudely a death spiral, whereby the net effect is going to be a hit on the currency.
Yeah.
And I would, I don't give investment advice, and I don't do this myself, but I would think shorting the pound is probably a reasonably good thing to do in the medium term, because I don't see any particular way in which that the UK economy can be turned around. And this gets back to our energy discussions, is that if you believe absolutely that green energy is going to be cheaper and more secure, then the notion that the UK could become a green energy superpower is perhaps real. I think the notion of a green energy superpower is an oxymoron, because, and probably need another hour to discuss why that's the case, but it's really to do with energy density. And there's a commentator called Dr. Tim Morgan who writes has been talking about this for a long time, actually, and he has latched onto the idea of surplus energy. It's not the amount of energy that you get or you use that's important. You have a cost of getting energy, and that's whether you're making solar panels or wind turbines, or whether you're discovering new oil fields or building a nuclear reactor. There's a cost to it. But if you get a very large amount of energy from that, way more than you got from the act of creating, or you don't create energy in the physical sense, but generating energy that can be used, that surplus energy is really what drives the rest of the economy, because we're getting work done almost for free at that point.
Yeah.
A good example of that is just a barrel of oil. And we'll ignore the primary energy fallacy for the moment about, how much of it gets lost in heat and so on. But the amount of energy in a barrel of oil is, if I remember, I haven't looked at a long time, but I think it's 5.5 million British thermal units, which you can translate into the amount of work that can be done by that. And it's something like 2 years of human labor is stored in one barrel of oil. And then if you took the minimum wage in the US and you paid someone 8 hours a day to do that work for 2 years, you'd end up with something like a bill for $160,000. So your $80 barrel is giving you $160,000 worth of work. So there's a huge mismatch between the price or the cost of the oil and what you get for it. And I don't mean that as the person who buys the oil, but I mean that from a societal point of view. The fact that 2% of the population can work in agriculture and probably less than 2% work in energy generation, and everybody else can do other stuff. Secondary industries, tertiary industries. You can be a professional video games player. That tells you how much surplus energy there is in the economy, because you're not doing anything you're not making stuff, you're not doing anything. You're really providing entertainment, and you're being paid extremely well for it, which is great. I mean, I'd love to do it, but you're not very good at video games, as my kids will tell you. But it's that notion that you need surplus energy, and the amount, and this is very similar to the energy return on energy invested notion that many people will be familiar with, but put more in a sort of a monetary value rather than energy value. And if you believe that green energy will be cheaper, then you can extrapolate and say, well, we'll have a wealthier economy. If you think that green energy is generally going to be more expensive, well, you compress that part of the surplus energy side, which, when you translate that, says people will get poorer. So I
Yeah.
genuinely don't believe there is a notion of a green energy superpower, and that's what the UK is striving to do. And to be honest, the markets don't believe it either.
Well, and it's not just the UK, it's Europe as well. And what's interesting is that you have France paying some, what I would say, lip service to a lot of the green stuff, and then wanting to build more nuclear power in order to sell that energy to the other countries like Germany that won't build it themselves and have invested in all of the wind and solar. But if I could just come back to the North Sea a little bit. Just yesterday, David Blackman, my podcast partner from the Energy Realities Monday Morning podcast, shared a story about a large number of production leases that were being issued by Norway, many for the North Sea. And unfortunately, it's unlikely the UK will follow suit. And so when we talk about the fields that are there, and you look at a map of where those boundary demarcation lines are between what area is controlled by Norway and which area of the North Sea is controlled by the UK, you see all of this development happening on the sort of Norwegian side and very little continuing to happen on the UK side. And I know part of it has to do with the ridiculous windfall taxes that are in place now until I think it is 2029. I mean, do they really think the Russian conflict is going to go on until 2029 and companies are somehow making windfall profits from this? So is it related to those windfall taxes? Is it also just the long-term view from investors and companies that, well, Labour Party now says they're going to double down on net zero. The Conservatives were pursuing net zero as well, but in a more gradual manner. But they're both, from my point of view, a uniparty with respect to net zero. So is it, I think it was something you wrote where you said that Norway can only do so much for Europe. So what's happening for the UK with the North Sea? Is there any way that they can come back from this? Do we have to wait another 5 years until this government is done? Will companies look at the North Sea as maybe being a possibility if the government changes, or will they just continue investing on the Norwegian side, which seems to care more about having some sense of energy security for Europe?
Yeah, I think you hit on a really good point there, and well, two good points. The first one is that the UK really does have a uniparty system when it comes to energy and policy, and I find that quite shocking. Um, and just anecdotally, the I gave a presentation in about just before COVID in 2020 on what I call the myth of utopia and the energy transition. And in the audience, there was a member of parliament, and I got invited to give a presentation to the Parliamentary Group on Energy Studies. And in the UK, the parliamentary groups, they're sort of special interest groups. They don't have any particular power, but when people are interested in a subject, they can invite people in to expand the knowledge base of politicians who don't necessarily know details of subjects, which is it's a very good system, except where it gets hijacked by lobbyists. But that's another story. Well, actually, no, it's a relevant story. I'd been listening to one of these before on the hydrogen economy, and pretty much everybody who had paid to be there was flogging some version of a hydrogen technology and how great it was going to be. And so there was no pushback whatsoever at all. So when I got to do this presentation, and I did it with my friend Catherine Potter, who talked about the electricity side of things, had a very short slot. I've got it on Vimeo, so I can send you the link to that as well. But really, I was just talking about the energy security side of things. But by a total coincidence of timing, I dropped my wife and kids at Heathrow Airport as they immigrated to Canada literally that morning. They went back to the hotel room, got on the video like this, and talked to the parliamentary group, because it was still COVID time at the time, so we did it on video. And I said, "Look, I don't have a horse in this race. I'm leaving." So I was going to give this to you straight. And whether that has any effect or not, I don't know. But what the point of that being that there are plenty of politicians who understand the issues that there are, and I think more on perhaps the Conservative side and the Labour side. But very tellingly, a German politician was heard on a hot mic incident saying, "I know what we need to do, but if we do it, we won't get re-elected." And this is where you get this cycle of activists, media, public opinion, and politicians. And I think the UK has got very heavily into that in about 2019, what I call sort of peak Greta, where it was political suicide to not be on the bandwagon. We had COP26 in Glasgow coming up in 2021. Boris Johnson, he became very evangelical about it. And that has really destroyed the ability to have a sensible conversation. And whether one likes other political systems or not, at least in the US and in Canada, indeed, we can have sensible conversations about the trade-offs. The point you made very early on in this discussion, and it was a point Chris Wright made yesterday at his confirmation hearing in the Senate, US Senate. He said something that annoyed people, which is there is no such thing as dirty energy and clean energy. And people said, well, of course there is. But his point being that any kind of energy has trade-offs. You build a dam, you affect the ecosystem. You build solar panels, you have to get the silicon and you have to smelt it, and you have a Chinese chain of dependency. So, and nuclear power, obviously, people worry about nuclear meltdowns and about proliferation of nuclear weapons and so on. So all of these have trade-offs, and I don't think those get addressed enough. So coming back to your previous question, the definition of energy security is kind of affordability and accessibility and so on and so forth. I think energy security and affordability are basically the same thing, because if your energy is available but not affordable, you don't really have energy security. And a good example of that was during the European gas crisis in 2022. Pakistan had contracted LNG volumes. And Pakistan's 230 million people, I think. It's a big country, a big economy. But they are quite energy poor. So in the middle of that, the companies who I probably shouldn't mention names, but it's in the press. I'm pretty sure it was ENI and Gunvor. They decided that it was better to break the contracts with Pakistan, pay a very large penalty fee for breaking the contracts, and sell the gas to Europe because they could still make money even after they paid all the things. But that left Pakistan in a situation where they were scrambling. They couldn't afford to outbid the Europeans. And basically they had to shut down the electricity supply in large parts of the country with rolling brownouts, which put people out of work. It shut businesses. The knock-on effects were enormous. We didn't really see much about them because it was Pakistan and it's not really reported here. But that notion that Pakistan thought they had energy security because they had contracted LNG. Well, their reaction to that is, well, you know what, we're going to go back to burning coal because it's much more reliable. We have some domestically. It's not great, but they have some domestically, and they can import it much more easily. And they're pretty sure they're not going to get outbid by the Europeans for coal. Although, even that,
Germany.
Yeah, I mean, when I put on my dystopian hat, I look at the UK and I'd take a bet that at some point UK is going to open up a coal-fired power station at some point in the next 30 years. There will be enormous gnashing of teeth and wailing. But
that goes to your point, your earlier point about diversification of supply, because when the energy crisis hit in the 70s, the big thing was about supply diversification, and it wasn't just with oil that we wanted to make sure that we weren't just sourcing it from Middle Eastern countries that could wield it as a weapon, but that they had to also invest more in coal power, which is why you saw a surge in coal power. There was a lot of investment in nuclear. There was investment in a bit of hydrogen, lots in fusion, lots in wind, lots in solar, because they wanted to diversify as widely as possible so that they weren't overly dependent on one form of energy, electricity production over another. And then there were all these promotions for, and much as that we see today. I wrote an article a couple of years ago saying what we're doing right now is revisiting the 1970s. They want houses to invest in insulation, to be more energy efficient, to all of these different projects and initiatives that they had in the 1970s. So it's like, once again, you're doing the same stuff when Europe and the IEA listed their 10 points for what to do after to conserve energy or whatever after Russia invaded Ukraine. It was the same things that they talked about in the 70s. So we have this idea that we need to diversify, and poor Pakistan to be, where's the charge of just transition and whatnot, where here's a developing country that was trying to do the right thing, investing in natural gas power plants, which have fewer emissions, if that's the really big issue in the world, than coal. And then, in 2023, they made an announcement that they were going to quadruple their coal power, as you say, because coal is cheaper, you can store it, there's fewer issues where it could be cut off. And in the 70s, we had oil being used as a weapon, and now, the Europeans use natural gas kind of as a weapon, inadvertently, I suppose you could say. But yeah, I mean, here we have supply diversification, which was spun as a good thing in the 70s. And now they want to put all of their eggs into the wind and solar basket with maybe battery storage, and it's still not enough.
Although, ironically, I do think that in the right circumstances, a use of wind and solar actually has a pretty good argument for it on the energy security point of view. And this is something that we see that there's a sort of an airbrushing of history that for a long time we've been told that these things are going to be cheaper, and now people are saying no, we never said they were going to be cheaper. Well, it's like, actually, no, yes, you did. But when the arguments they're not perfectly green, there are trade-offs, so that argument kind of falls away a bit. They're not cheaper, that argument's going to fall away a bit. And again, there's a whole separate discussion there as well, which I've just gone a little sidetrack on for the moment, is that one of the things I love about these discussions is that you can have two things being perfectly true at the same time, and one of them being wrong. An example of that is the idea of wind and solar panels being the cheapest form of electricity generation. It is true in specific circumstances if you're talking about generation. And so if you've got a solar panel somewhere in a desert environment where you want to run an air conditioning unit at the same time that you're generating, it probably is the cheapest way of doing it. But if you're trying to run a country like the UK or Germany, and you want to look at the cost of solar and then all the things that need to come with it, whether it's batteries or backup and so on and so forth, it is no longer the cheapest form. So you can have both these things being true at once, but one of them being more true or more relevant than the other. So, and I think we see that a lot in the energy transition. But sorry, that was just a little parenthèse, as the French would say, a little sidetrack. The energy security thing is interesting. So when you go through the sort of the trilemma, and the environmental impact is shown to be a problem and the cost is shown to be a problem, then the next best justification for wind and solar is energy security. And we're seeing Ed Miliband doing this quite a lot in the UK now, saying, well, if we reduce our dependence on imported gas because we've got wind and solar. And honestly, I'm fairly sympathetic to that point of view, because when you're importing a fuel, you have to have a continuous flux of the fuel coming in. And a bit like the UK in the Second World War, when the Atlantic convoys were being U-boated, if your supply of fuel or food is disrupted, it's a very quick it's very quick to have a problem. If you've got wind and solar, yes, you may depend on China for the fabrication of these things. Once they're installed, you do have 20 years worth of energy generation potential from them. So yes, they'll need to be replaced and so on. So there is a dependency, but it's not the same as the dependency of needing a cargo of oil or gas coming in every 2 days. So I can see that side of things. And I think that's where people the ideology gets in the way. If you say we're going to do that, we recognize it's going to be a bit more expensive, and we recognize we're going to have gas to back it up. So we build that structure, and we do it in complete, and I don't even know the English expression for this, but the connaissance de cause, in complete eyes wide open understanding of what we're getting into. I think that's a reasonable way of running energy policy. If you say we want to do it and we want to get rid of gas as well, good luck with that. It isn't going to work. And when I see a country, and I try and, because I see the whole world through the sort of a lens of energy, when I look at the way countries make decisions about their energy policy, there's a lot of hope that the Paris Accords and so on, people are doing things because they believe they're going to solve climate change. Now that may be true for Canada and for the UK and Europe. That may be the belief. When it comes to China and their energy policy, it's a very different scenario. People look at it and say, look, they're putting in more wind and solar than the rest of the world combined. Clearly, they believe that they're fixing climate change. And then people on the other side, well, no, look how much coal-powered generation they're putting in. And then the argument is, well, yes, but that's not going to be used more than 50% because they've got the whole thing's a bit of a mess. When you step back from it and say, what is China likely to do in the next 10 years? The answer is it's likely to invade Taiwan. And that may well, and again, lots of ramifications around that. There is a demographic problem in China that's coming through to the economic strength, and when you start to have a weakness in the economic strength, then the expansionist tendencies will potentially play out more rapidly. But there's not much there's nothing the Europeans could do about it, and there's not a great deal the Americans could do about defending Taiwan. I think they've done all sorts of modeling scenarios, and almost all of them that the Chinese win. Yeah. Because of the proximity, the physical proximity of Taiwan to China. But what you could do is you could send the American fleets into the Indian Ocean and the Middle East and cut off all of the supply of LNG and oil to China. And China is one of the biggest importers I think it's the biggest importer of oil, and the second biggest of gas. Now, some of that gas comes from Russia, but a lot of it's LNG. So you could cripple the Chinese economy pretty quickly. Now, they're not stupid by any means. If I can think of this, they thought of it 20 years ago, no doubt about that. So what's they done about it? Well, they've got a very large strategic reserve of oil, which they haven't drained to support the economy, unlike other countries. But very specifically, the rollout of coal and nuclear and wind and solar it reduces their dependence on importation of oil and gas. So from a geopolitical point of view, you can see all of those things being driven not by cost, not by climate, but by a notion of how do we manage our expansionist foreign policy goals in a world where we still have to import oil and gas. We reduce the amount we have to import oil and gas, so we're less dependent on it. So from again, looking at the world through an energy lens, that would be my take on Chinese energy policy. They're not driven by cost, they're not driven by climate.
I agree. And I think they're completely security driven, and it's in alignment with the 100-year marathon and their Made in China initiative. But one of the interesting aspects that you bring out there is China has already exhausted I think they've reached their peak of drilling for their own oil and gas. I think they're at their peak, and therefore to have the kind of economy that they want and the security of supply, they've had to diversify for all of these different things. But with respect to the UK and Europe, yes, Europe is somewhat mineral poor, but they've banned the possibility of exploration and development within their borders, except for Norway. So there's apparently quite a lot of natural gas that was found in Poland and even Germany that could be accessed through fracking. The UK apparently also has quite a lot of potential resources that could be extracted through fracking, and that's been banned. So Ed Miliband wants to talk about being secure because they don't want to import. They do have the potential with the North Sea as well to not have to import, that they could be producing their own oil and gas, and they choose not to, and then make a case that it's about energy security. If you were serious about energy security, you would be developing and diversifying all of the sources that are within your control. But they've made this political decision not to do it. And this is linked to what you'd mentioned earlier about how the activists and whatnot seem to be setting the tone for what politicians wish to adopt or not. And I would argue that with the Conservative Party, this shift happened with David Cameron, because when the Conservatives formed their coalition government with the Liberal Democrats back in, I think it was 2009, 2010, he definitely took the party more towards the environment and said, if we want to win that middle ground, we really have to embrace the environment. They never got rid of the Climate Change Committee, which is an abomination in my view, which is controversial, but they never got rid of it. They continue to take the advice of this very politicized activist group. And this is one of the reasons why nothing changed. Nothing changed with respect to environment policy. They would do these half efforts, like, okay, we're going to have fracking, and then there would be a little bit of resistance. Oh, okay, we'll back off, And I think that part of the problem isn't just that there's activists out there making noise. It's why did the politicians listen to them? And I'm not so sure that they would actually lose in an election. It seemed like, talking to the people around where I live, in the last election, they felt like there was no one to vote for because they all stood for the same thing. The Liberal Democrats, Labor, the Conservatives, and then there's a Green Party. And then there was Reform, and Reform, people really didn't know much about them. So a lot of people who would typically have voted Conservative voted for Lib Dem because they're like, I don't know. They all say the same thing. So what can I do? And so there's that element. I think there needs to be a little more research and conversation into what drives that sort of media embracing the controversy of Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion or any of these other groups that then translate into politicians wanting to appease those people. So if it's a policy of appeasement, why is that? Why do they feel like they have to appease that noisy minority? And they are a minority. And if that minority is the one that's selling this idea, then why isn't there any pushback by the politicians now? Is it because they want to believe that? Are they being told that if they, like David Cameron saying, well, if we don't embrace this, we won't get elected? I don't know. I think people would prefer some honesty, in understanding. If you told people honestly and not the fairy tale, if we're going to talk about energy diversification, and maybe this is a good backup, it's not the most efficient use of resources to have wind and solar, but still have to have a complete grid to back it up, because we like to have, it's part of the social contract, really, that we have an expectation that we will have electricity on demand. When we want it, it's there, and it's a reasonable, affordable price. And despite the articles out there saying that people just need to get used to interruptions and paying more, that's not what the agreement was. So anyway, that's my little rant for today.
No, I think you hit on a lot of really good points there. I mean, the US election was actually fascinating, because you have Trump, who's a very alienating person, very polarized politics, and there's the MAGA crowd, there's his base. We know that. So everything he says, they're going to love. Then you had the Biden fiasco, I should say, with Kamala Harris being sort of put into the running, and there's a very strong base. I don't think it has a name, but there's a very strong base for the Democrat support as well, which isn't going to change. So you've got these two sides which are basically not going to change. So the election was being fought in the middle, and you would think that with Trump's rather populist approach, he would alienate the center. But in fact, he didn't. He captured the center and won the popular vote and won a very strong mandate. And I think that's sort of reflected in a study I've seen here in Canada as well, done by a team out of the University of Ottawa, Monica Gattinger. And what you see is that people are really concerned about the cost of living. And this goes back to what I think is probably the most significant thing of the first quarter of this century, was the Gilets jaunes movement in France. They were a bit before their time, but really they were saying, we don't want to be paying more for fuel so that some rich guy can get a subsidized Tesla in Paris. The notion that climate change is the #1 priority for voters, that may have been true 10 years ago. But I think for all sorts of reasons, partly the alarmist side of that has turned a lot of people off. And partly people are really seeing that cost of living is a much bigger question. The statistics in Canada, they're extraordinary. I think in the UK it's even worse. But the number of people visiting food banks, the number of people who are $200 away from being bankrupt, the affordability stuff, and that really gets people's attention. So when you start doing things like carbon taxes on top of it, it's almost as if the policies that people want to do because they believe they're the right thing to do for the planet are going to create the sort of the monster that they're terrified of, which is the Trumpian kind of populist approach. And there doesn't seem to be a great deal of self-reflection or consideration about how they're creating that. I mean, we'll see this with the Democratic Party in the US. They'll probably just double down on the policies that got them kicked out of office, which is going to be, and what you need in democracies is you need checks and balances, because neither approach is right. You've got to be somewhere. There have to be, again, political trade-offs and so on.
Right.
But coming back to the NGOs and the media, there's a great book called Bad News, by an American author who's called Batya. I'll have to find the name. Batya Ungar something. It's a hyphenated name. And she's a journalist who points out that in newsrooms where you think there is going to be the most diversity you could imagine, there will be gender diversity, there will be sexual orientation diversity, there will be people of color, there will be everything, because that's how newsrooms work. you will end up with the most extraordinary level of groupthink that you can imagine. There's no diversity of thought because everybody has the same political views. And if you translate that across every newsroom in the US or the UK, you can see it. I commented on the FT yesterday anonymously that I thought the article I thought I was reading the Guardian, because the angle that was taken in the article was so one-sided. It was extraordinary, and The Economist has gone the same way as well. It's utterly depressing. So
Can I jump in there though,
yeah,
because you mentioned populism, and quite often the reflexive, I would say, smear is to say that, well, we have this rise of right-wing populism. But if you look back, and from what you've said earlier about politicians wanting to get elected, couldn't one say that politicians have been captured in some respect by climate populism? I mean, what is populism except that you're feeling pressure from certain activist segments of society? And you could make a case that politicians over the past 10, 15 years have really fallen prey or been sort of singing the tune of the climate populists. And so they're embracing their own form of populism, but they just don't like it when it's from a different group.
yeah.
So, yeah.
I
What
think
do you think of that?
there's a, you know, I say I come from an energy and an engineering background, so I'm not a political scientist. But actually, my son's doing political science and economics, which is good because he teaches me stuff every so often. And one of the things he showed me quite early on was something I had seen 10 years ago, but I've forgotten about, which is called the political compass, where you have
Yeah.
a 2 by 2 grid, and it's sort of left wing, right wing, as you'd expect. And there's a notion that the further right you go, the more authoritarian you get, and the further left you go, because it's liberal. The word liberal means, with a small L, it kind of means liberal, and you don't expect it to be authoritarian. But the political compass has a y coordinate axis as well, which is authoritarian and libertarian, and you can do a series of questions and find out where you place on it. But what we're seeing is that a lot of these, again, liberal, democratic, uh, politicians and activists are firmly in the top left-hand corner because they are left-wing but very authoritarian, and they're authoritarian without even recognizing that they're authoritarian.
Yeah.
It's just that anything we don't like is misinformation or disinformation, and there's a lovely meme of this which shows the top left-hand corner as being sort of me, the next level around it being slightly different from me is alt-right, and everybody else are Nazis.
That's a great meme.
um, and obviously it's an exaggeration for the humorous effect and so on, but you can sort of see that there are very authoritarian tendencies that come in when people when people are challenged. The fact that the UK police are investigating tweets in the US, the US said, "Come and get us." It's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. So
It's
I want to just kind of bring it, because we're running, I think, close to an hour now. I just want to sort of bring in one last element, and that is one of the main lenses of geopolitics is geography. And, Trump has made these statements about Greenland, about Canada, about Panama. And so, how would you see these geographies fitting in with the sort of energy and national security? And I think, in the sense that critical minerals are needed for all sorts of military tech, not just EVs and wind and solar and batteries and whatnot, but there's a lot of sort of modern day technological and military equipment that requires a lot of these critical minerals. So, how do these geographic regions fit in with energy and national security?
Yeah, I think again we may have to do a whole nother podcast on that at some point. But um, I think that energy policy is very dictated by geography, and you can see very obvious examples of that. Iceland has wonderful geothermal power. Well, that's a function of geography. New Zealand's the same.
Yeah.
If you're sitting on a bunch of gas, well, you're probably going to use it, and historically coal the same. So you know even a place like Quebec, where I live, we've got 98% of our electricity comes from hydro, but there is pressure to roll out, wind and solar. Although looking out the window today, solar probably wouldn't be during the middle of winter here. And in some ways, I can actually be sympathetic to that as well, because hydro is a big battery. So if you can reduce the amount of water you run through the system by using wind when you have it, that makes sense, because hydro is susceptible to droughts. We've seen that in Norway, we've seen it in Brazil. So actually having a combined system of wind and solar and hydro makes sense. But that's very geographically specific. And there are many countries which don't have any particular geographical advantages. And so they have to think very carefully about how they diversify their sources, what they're going to use. Uranium is another good one. When most of the processed uranium comes out of the former Soviet Union now, is that a problem? Probably less so, given that a lot of nuclear waste can be reprocessed now and used as fuel. But in terms of critical minerals, yeah, I think the same thing applies. But where I would be far more worried, I think critical minerals can be found. Greenland obviously has huge potential. I think the idea of America invading it is pretty off the charts. It's not on my 2025 bingo, but America buying it with the agreement of the Greenlanders. I think Greenlanders is not the right word, but of the residents of Greenland, maybe. And I don't, I think there's the sort of flippant remark about Canada being the 51st state. Obviously, it's got immediate pushback, Canadians say, but there's a huge irony there. In 2012, Trudeau said Canada was the first post-nation state. We can't define what is Canadian. Well, I disagree. I think the nation state hasn't evaporated. You have multiculturalism, but you can have that within a nation state. And I don't think Canada's going to roll over. But it has opened up a very interesting set of conversations about, how much would America have to pay to annex Canada, to make it worthwhile? What would be the synergies? What would be almost like a business M&A deal? What would the advantages be and the disadvantages? And there are a lot of people horrified by the idea because they have some derangement syndrome. But there is a conversation there which is really surprising in the modern world. We think our boundaries are very fixed. But of course, they're not. This kind of process has happened all the time. Bits of France used to be in Germany, Alaska used to belong to Russia, Louisiana, most of Texas was Mexico. There are all sorts of, depends on how far back you want to go. We're just not used to it in the modern world. I think the danger with the sort of Trumpian approach of throwing these things out is it suddenly, if you're sitting in the Kremlin or somewhere else, you must think, oh, well, it's okay to start mixing with bits of other countries because the US is saying they're going to do it. So I think it's a very dangerous precedent. I think a much better way is the trade route. If the US wants access to the minerals and the oil in Canada, don't put tariffs on them. Let's just reinforce the NAFTA trade agreements. And if you want, give us long-term contracts so we don't sell them to anybody else. I mean, if that's what you want to do, that would work as well. I think there's a much more how should we say it, aligned version of this than a confrontational one. But hey, I'm not in politics.
Right, I agree. At least it opened up Canadians to think about what's been going on and what's a better way forward. Because clearly, I'm working on a piece talking about, have we been good neighbors to each other? What does that mean? And, you know, there's there's been things written back in the '60s about the good neighbor policy in North America and what that meant in terms of the Cold War, and then what happened after the Cold War. And, when you had the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, that was part of the sort of multilateral, things that were happening in the world. Canada really didn't have a market. The United States was trying to shore up North America with respect to the Soviet Union, and so it made a lot of sense to do that. And then there was NAFTA afterwards. So it's important to think about these things. What has Canada been doing with respect to its defense, with its energy policy, with the fact that we can't actually build anything in the country anymore? It takes forever if you get companies spend tens of millions, if not billions, in order to go through an approval process, and there's no guarantee they'll get to complete the project after that process is done 15 years down the road. So, maybe that's helpful to get Canadians to rethink these things. And if I can just kind of switch a little bit to when you were talking about your time as and I'll explain how this is related to your time as being um, an advisor and dealing with companies that are trying to get investment based on their reserves, their oil and gas reserves. So, what happens in this new world of sustainability accounting where those reserves, instead of being an asset, are now going to be considered a liability? Because under the International Sustainability Standards Board and their how they quantify a company's emissions, they have to account for the embedded emissions in their proven reserves and in their probable reserves. And so if an investment firm is basing their decisions on emissions, how how can a company that has a tremendous amount of proven reserves, and maybe they've been exploring and there's probable reserves, and now that's going to count against them? So I feel like we're in this new sort of world where we want all of the security, but we're throwing up roadblocks that stops companies from actually getting secure supplies of energy or minerals.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like an irresistible force and an immovable object, except that one of them is going to give. And we saw that last week or 2 weeks ago in Europe, where Europe's trying to impose European carbon accounting standards on foreign countries, and they will confiscate 5% of the revenues of. I don't even know how they think they're going to do it. And it's a bit
Global
like
revenues, yeah.
global revenues. And Qatar said, you've got to be kidding. You're importing our LNG. You want us to apply, you want your rules to apply to us. Well, it's very simple. You won't get our gas. It's really simple. And I just think we're going to see more of that. It'll be tough for companies and again, another subject for a podcast one day is just this notion that where legislation fails and where the activists have failed through legislation, they're winning through regulation.
Yep.
There's a notion that civilizations collapse when regulation gets to a certain point and nothing can get done. I do wonder whether we're not very far away from that.
Yeah, for sure.
With all the reporting restrictions and accounting, and I don't just mean in the oil and gas space. I think it is much broader. Everybody has to deal with this, and there's a massive industry now in consultants who will advise you on your carbon accounting, and it won't be good enough, and they can then, for a bigger fee, they can come in and help you fix the problem. It's getting very out of hand, and again, in the same way we've seen pushback, I think we'll see more pushback on that, just because that is a cost of doing business which will get pushed through to the consumers. And there are the longer that the West, and particularly Europe, accepts that and gets poorer, the less influence they will have in the world. And what we will see is that countries like Qatar and others who are more pragmatic about this, they will just continue funding and managing the global supply chain. In a sense, and I wrote an article on this quite recently called the conceit at the table, where you want to be at the table, you want to have your voice heard, and this is Trudeau and it's Keir Starmer and it's everybody else. And there's going to come a point where people are just going to say, "Who are you? You've collapsed your economies. The old adage was that foreign policy should be to speak softly and carry a big stick." And now the idea is people talk loudly but have absolutely no leverage. It's a very self-defeating policy. If you're going to impoverish your country and create deindustrialization, no one's going to listen to your climate goals.
Yeah. I think one of the key architects of all of that has been Mark Carney, and he was behind the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and all of those different things where now they have to reorient because the U.S. has there was an investigation from the House Judiciary Committee. They wrote a couple reports where they interviewed Mark Carney and they interviewed Mary Shapiro, and Mary Shapiro's been also very strongly involved with GFANZ with Mike Bloomberg. And they were talking about, how they would use moral suasion with these pledges to convince companies, banks and institutional investors to stop investing in oil and gas or anything that's high emitting. And so now these banks, where there's a threat of antitrust coming with the new administration, suddenly they're pulling out. At the same time, as you noted in one of your recent Substack articles, is that they're saying, "Oh, we're still committed 100% to net zero by 2050. We're just not going to be pressured by this group." Like, which seems rather hilarious.
Their position, so they can drop either side of the fence on that one. Yeah.
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 I think I take more pleasure from sort of putting silly titles to my articles than from much else. And that one I called Only Fans or Lonely Fans.
Lonely Fans. I thought that was great.
So that's my a little bit of fun. But no, I think it's interesting point. I mean, I commented on this years ago, again back in 2015, 2016, when I was starting to get into this process of seeing LPs and investors dictating essentially divestment from oil and gas. And I wondered at the time when we would see the first class action lawsuit, because they have a fiduciary duty to make money. And actually, for about 10 years, it was really easy because you could make money by not investing in oil and gas. I mean, oil and gas did not have very good returns from 2012 to 2020. So you could have a financial argument that you were doing the right thing on behalf of your pensioners or whatever it was, that you were investing outside of the oil and gas space. You were doing it for other reasons, but you could justify it from a financial one. But when the world changed, which it has done, and oil and gas stocks have done very well in the last 2 or 3 years. The green energy funds have collapsed. The share price of Ørsted is, and you see put that against Exxon, and they're going completely different directions. So that financial argument is no longer valid. So if people and pensioners are losing money in their pension funds because people are taking climate action and they're not doing their fiduciary duty, which is to manage money. And I heard this from one of the, again, I won't say who it was, but it was the head of one of the Canadian pension funds who was asked this question in an open forum. And he said very pragmatically, my primary objective is to get the returns I need so that my pensioners can get their pensions. That's what drives my business, and it's what has to drive it. And that has been subverted by things like GFANZ.
Yeah, I mean, and especially with their net zero asset manager alliance. But if you look at the kinds of things that some of these big pension funds have been investing in, the returns haven't been what they say they want to do. I guess that's the diplomatic way of saying they've been making foolish investments into things that are considered supportive of the transition, and has actually lost them money. And so the return, if they would have been pursuing investment strategies that weren't designed for the to pursue the energy transition, then the returns would have been much different.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one because with hindsight, you can always do that.
You
But
can always do it right.
yeah,
Yeah.
but again, if you go back to the 2015, 2021 period, they were making a lot of money in those spaces, and they would have lost a lot of money had they been in oil and gas. So, I think there's, I think it's really a question of whether the motivation is correct. If you're doing it because you think you're going to make money from it, which is your fiduciary duty, then it's the right thing to do. If you're doing it because you think you're going to save the planet and you're going to appease the NGOs, then it's probably not the right reason to do it.
Right.
But it's
Good point.
but again, I think the whole point of Carney's GFANZ was we have 130 trillion of assets being managed by our members. Therefore, we can change the world. Well, when that money goes away and has a different view, it also changes the world, but not in the way they want. So, I mean, it's going to be fascinating. I thought the timing, and that's why I wrote about it yesterday, was fascinating. That Mark Carney, I think he's going to be announcing his candidacy for the Liberal Party leadership today, which would de facto make him prime minister at when Parliament's resumed. At the same time, you had BlackRock pulling out of the GFANs as being the last of many who have pulled out. So, an interesting contrast, at least.
Very much so. Yeah, I'll be curious to see what he's going to say in for his leadership run. I've heard some rumors that he's going to say he would get rid of the carbon tax, which is hilarious because he's been going on and on and on for at least 5 or 6 years, talking about how every country should have a carbon price. So now suddenly, and I'm thinking, okay, is he going to make it like the UK and EU, where right now, when you have a carbon tax on your heating bill or something, as you probably know, you can look on your bill and it tells you what that carbon tax is. Is he just going to roll it in so people can't see what, like, as much as I hate the GST in Canada, the goods and services tax, and it's really inconvenient when you go to a shop and you buy something and then the tax is added after, and it's like, oh crap, you know, I budgeted for something else and now I have this extra tax on there. But at least you know what you're getting charged. Whereas in the UK and the EU, it's all rolled in. So you get the price and you have no idea what you're being charged for the sales tax. The VAT is what they call it here, value added tax. So I could totally see him doing something like that in Canada where, oh, sure, there's a carbon tax, you just can't see it.
Yeah, they did that in Germany. They had something like 30 billion a year on the electricity bills, which was rolled into general taxation. So because people wouldn't have accepted it if they'd seen exactly what it was. So I think there'll be more and more of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking your time. We've gone over. I'm sure we could talk all afternoon,
We should
but
do a Joe
we'll have
Rogan
to
on
do
this, I think.
another episode.
Thank you so much for hosting, Tammy. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. Have a great day and look forward to chatting with you again.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.